Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Josh Hodges. I'm your host today of Online with an Architect. Very grateful to have a good friend and former colleague of mine with us today, Michael Webster. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks very much, Josh.
Fantastic.
It's good to be here.
For anyone who doesn't know Michael, I can't imagine anyone in the industry doesn't know Michael, but just in case we find that one person, Michael, can you do a quick intro for us?
Sure, no problem. I've been with Nutanix for about 10 years. I'm a principal architect in engineering. So I helped build the Nutanix product, and we both helped, pioneer the product from the early days. The company started about 13 years ago. Prior to Nutanix, I was at VMware for about 4 years, helping VMware build their enterprise applications business globally as well. So I've been in the IT industry for about 20 years, virtualizing the impossible, migrating mainframes and Unix systems and enterprise applications for the largest companies in the world to a better place and to a hybrid cloud.
Yeah, fantastic. So, Michael and I worked together at Nutanix, of course. So from 2013, we both joined very, in short succession. I joined first, Michael joined a couple of months later. And today we're really going to talk about HCI. We're going to focus on that hyper-converged infrastructure piece and talk about pioneering that industry. And, the fact that Dheeraj Pandey, the founder of Nutanix, really, did start that whole industry. And people like Michael and I jumped on board, thought it was fantastic. And, that was lucky. I won't put that down to skill. I think that was a little bit of luck. But, so that's what we're going to talk about today. And I have an infected eye for anyone who's wondering. I'm okay. I was reading some bad architecture and it infected my eye. So that's the cause of that one. So let's jump in really quick, Michael. Can you give us a 30-second overview of what is HCI, for just in case anyone's living under a rock?
Yeah, I guess the best way to describe HCI is like an iPhone. So it converges multiple components of infrastructure and removes parts and processes to make the infrastructure for any application simple. And it used to be, hyper-converged infrastructure, but now it's more like hybrid cloud infrastructure because it can run everywhere. It can run in a colo, in a cloud hyperscaler, in your own data center, on an edge. So it's pervasive. It's not about where it can be implemented. It's really everywhere. But it's converging compute, storage, and network into a single solution and the management of that into a single solution and making it just simple and easy to manage and cutting out all the, extra separate components from separate vendors you would have had to self-integrate in the past, which adds complexity and cost and makes, running an environment very operationally expensive.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. So, you really hit on a couple of the next things we're going to discuss, which is what's HCI trying to achieve? It's simplicity, it's cost reduction, it's risk mitigation, it's allowing admins to focus higher up the stack than just infrastructure. So, I think in the early days, certainly when I joined Nutanix, at the same time as yourself, the platform was very well known for VDI. And obviously VDI with traditional SANs had all sorts of performance problems because the SAN became the bottleneck. Traditional SANs obviously weren't as well built as the modern ones. But
it was great for a pilot, though. You could run 50 users on it; it worked perfectly. And then as soon as you tried to scale up to 5,000 users, then it would completely break.
Geez, if that was really the issue you were talking about in that example.
Well, there's been a lot. That's a very common experience back in the early days of VDI or even Citrix presentation server and the other types of, end user virtualization stacks. And the real key killer benefit that HCI had for that workload was being able to linearly scale so that as soon as you knew how many users or how many sessions you could get per node, if you added more nodes on, you got exactly the same number again. So there was no question if you did a pilot for 50 users, could you roll out 5,000? The answer was absolutely yes. And you knew exactly what you were going to get every single time. And it seemed funny to me back then that nobody thought that type of a capability would be good for enterprise applications, because that's all they were thinking about was VDI. But that linear scalability and the ability to handle failure gracefully and predictably were really key things that enterprise applications needed as well. without all the complexity that comes with, managing, separate storage networks and everything else that comes within, 50 million different management tools. That was pretty common. It's a bit of hyperbole, but, there's so many different management consoles back in the day, and you'd need, multiple different teams to get anything to work.
And
whereas with hyper-converged infrastructure, you really can.
It wasn't just multiple windows. You actually had to be an expert in each of those different products.
Absolutely.
So the complexity was there. And even when you had a team of expertise, it became difficult to get the job done and time consuming. So I don't think it was just the fact that there was, so many management consoles. You had to have the right expertise. And even if you had the right expertise, it was still difficult. So, to me, that was the thing. I was used to installing these 3-tier solutions, but it wasn't quick. It wasn't easy. There was a lot of decisions to be made. And I think where HCI really helped was removing a lot of those decisions that had to be made and giving you a product that kind of just worked, for most things out of the box.
Well, it was really built on the cloud and hyperscale principles early on because, the founders came from building Google file system and things like that. So the idea of being able to start small and scale out and scale predictably and linearly and handle failures in software rather than, specialized hardware components really made a big difference to that simplification. And the idea that, the virtualization idea, from the last 20 years has always been, you don't have to worry so much about individual components and you can focus more on the business because we're, taking care of operations. But that, okay, sure, that was true for running tens of thousands of physical servers individually and having to manually do everything. Virtualization did help that, but it didn't really get you to the point where you could simplify the operations, spend significantly less time actually doing the management components, having significantly more automation, and focusing more on higher value add activities in the business and providing solutions and being the office of yes rather than the office of no. Because otherwise your customers are going to go to the cloud, put their credit card down and get whatever they want straight away. So you want to be able to provide solutions that have the economics and the capability of a cloud environment, but wherever that happens to be. And the funny thing is, the whole hybrid cloud thing is pretty normal now. Doing this in, Azure, AWS, on-prem, colo, etc. But that original idea, we didn't even know it was going to be hybrid cloud at the time, but that was sort of the idea that we, pioneered, Nutanix pioneered, and others picked up on, over 10 years ago now. And now it's mainstream. It's everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, in those early days, we both heard the objections. It's only a VDI platform. It doesn't perform. It's not resilient. It's not scalable. It's, it's not all these things. And certainly, when I first joined, run some basic tests, seems to perform pretty well. Of course, for VDI, it was a very good platform already. So when we joined, we jumped straight into a brand new team of business critical apps focusing on, seeing what the product could do and maybe couldn't do. And I really enjoy that. I really look back with fond memories, actually, because I enjoyed going through trying to work out what worked and what didn't. And, some apps worked okay. They were viable. Some apps weren't viable at all. And the engineering effort, the architecture piece to get the features implemented or the changes to how the product worked, like tiering across SSD and HDD, things like that, I really found fascinating. Yeah. So, trying to push that you could run Exchange or SQL or Oracle or SAP, all these things our team worked on over many years. We ended up achieving all those things, in
SAP HANA. We drove the whole certification category for Hyper-Converged for SAP HANA and got Nutanix AHV certified for that with equivalent performance statistics to bare metal with nothing else on. So, we made some pretty massive strides for the whole industry in being able to achieve a scalable solution that was significantly simpler and the same performance as bare metal. Even though it was virtualized. And we saw that even in core banking systems where we did, head-to-head benchmarks against, traditional infrastructures like HP Superdomes and 3PAR type storage and Exadata. And for certain applications, we were getting equivalent or better performance. And I mean, we jumped in the deep end with Exchange and Oracle RAC. I mean, if anything can run Oracle RAC in a stable manner and still allow live migrations and, automated upgrades and expansions and contractions without it breaking, then you've got a pretty good foundation, because it doesn't take too much to go wrong for an Oracle RAC environment to really run into trouble. You need very skilled administrators, and you need a very stable infrastructure under the covers. And we were able to build the infrastructure and get all the engineering in place to make sure that those applications work solidly. And even our customers challenged us to do things maybe ahead of where we were comfortable. We started running Oracle RAC on VMware and proved that it worked very successfully, and we got quite a good customer adoption on that. And then before Nutanix AHV Hypervisor even existed, we had a customer say, hey, it works so well on VMware, now you need to make it work on AHV, and you've got 48 hours to do it. Thanks very much.
Yeah, I remember those requests very well. Customers wanted new features, new capabilities. They want to run new apps, and all sorts of objections from vendors. Usually, software vendors are saying that's not supported. You can't run it on NPX. You can't run it on HCI. HCI doesn't work for server applications, and we would have to go through and validate. And that was one of my first projects. Actually, it was looking at Exchange and also getting the platform actually certified with VMware as a NFS storage platform. So I remember going a lot of late nights, running a lot of tests to make sure everything was resilient and performant, and in just adhering to the protocol. In fact, a lot of that testing was for. So yeah, that was a lot of fun. But all the objections that HCI would never be for server workloads or business critical apps, I understood where they came from. But just looking at the product conceptually, I always thought, no, this has potential, and this whole market segment is going to take off. And like I said, maybe a bit of luck in there, but we were right. We made the right bet and went with it. So that was really good fun. Actually, I remember your YouTube video where you showed Oracle RAC, to your point earlier. vMotion
under extreme load, 100% CPU, live migrations, everything, and it just kept working, no drop transactions whatsoever. And that was 10 years ago now. And then we just built from there, and now it's commonplace. We've got thousands of customers running Oracle RAC, or hundreds of customers running SAP HANA on Hyper-Converged Infrastructure, and many other platforms, like critical platforms, hospitals. We've done some recent benchmarking certification process with a really large hospital running NPX software, which is massive in the US, and getting 1 million IOPS out of a single VM with less than 5 milliseconds latency. And, people often said, oh, well, that's never going to be possible in HCI. And I mean, even today, that's an awful lot of performance out of a single virtual machine. And this is just what we're able to achieve for this particular use case for one of the benchmarks. And even for the more like the data warehouse type workload for that particular hospital, getting 14 gigabytes a second out of a very robust but very cost-effective economic platform that can still scale. That's that's not the end. That's just what they needed, and that's what we certified, and it can still scale up further from there. And that's that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember back in the day when you had like a storage constraint, the performance was topped out, and you pretty much were doing controller swaps and all sorts of huge tasks to get any more performance. But, those first tests we used to do where we would add a node, we'd measure the performance, we'd measure latency, we'd measure the Medusa cache and how efficient it was, or how inefficient it was at some times, and just watch how things would improve. And, I'm very excited with, the next few years with HCI, because I think you touched on the point that I was going to raise later, which is HCI is very much mainstream. It's the basis of hyperscaler and hypervisor solutions. So whether it's NC2 or whether it's the VMC on AWS or it's Azure VMware solution, HCI is the basis for that. Whether it's a Nutanix product or a VMware product, that architecture and that concept is the basis for pretty much all the innovation in the multi-cloud space. And yeah, we were there at the beginning, which was quite cool. We were quite lucky to get that opportunity to jump in.
And now it's really evolving and adapting for new workloads like containers, cloud native, AI, ML, GPT type, internal large language models, and inferencing for fraud detection, and security applications, and all sorts of different things are now coming on the platform as well, because the platform just keeps evolving as new technologies and new workloads become adopted in the customer base. It's exciting to be at the forefront of these innovations as well, and seeing the real benefits that customers can get very quickly from these things. I understand you're going to Vegas very shortly, and you're going to be in some of our customer sites there, where they're going to be monitoring you with AI at all times, and it's all running on Nutanix platforms.
Very good care of me. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure they will take very good care of you.
But
just make sure you don't get any 5-hour energy shots in your vodka.
No, we definitely have never spiked Michael Webster's vodka with an energy drink. We definitely didn't do that. We are very mature in our team. So, so let's talk about some of the things that, from a business critical apps perspective, what was some of the problems that we had with business critical apps, and then what were we doing with HCI to try and resolve those issues?
Well, I mean, one of the bigger problems was supportability, certifications. Back in the earlier days, there was certainly performance challenges that we had to work through, and getting the right configurations, because when we first started, there was like one option and that was it, and it was great for certain things, but it didn't really cater to any variation for enterprise applications. So we really had to drive platform innovation. So different options in terms of server configurations and types of storage. We innovated and got the first NVMe products and Intel Optane and everything into the platform to really reach significantly higher I/O performance at lower latencies, lower response times, and bigger memory footprints, more CPUs, all the sorts of things that larger scale enterprise applications needed. And then driving the certification processes so the application vendors would also support it as well. Like we've already mentioned, working with the likes of Epic to get their blessing, to get the platform on the target platform list, which means it can be used in life-critical environments, getting on the, creating the entire certification program for SAP, and then running it and getting certified. And that was these are multi-year efforts, because you're the new kid on the block, and where do you get the evidence and the proof that you're actually suitable for these types of workloads, where if something goes down, it's multi-millions of dollars per hour and costs and risk and things like that. And how do you really prove that you're a better option for that, and you can scale and expand as needed? And then supportability, making sure everything's supported from end to end. So working with all those ISVs, doing all the testing and certification, getting the core banking vendors to come on board, and building customer case studies and the evidence that really is needed to run at scale and run across enterprises. And that's that's been an evolution, and it's still an evolution, because there's always ever expanding requirements, and that's why I like really working with the teams that we're working with, and having direct customer interaction, and having a very short feedback loop to the product teams, because we can take feedback directly from a customer on something that they're contemplating doing or thinking about for their future vision for the next 3 to 5 years, and then building it into our product roadmap and trying to make sure that aligns with the stages and steps that the customers are at. And, we don't always get the timing right, but we eventually get there. It's like, software eventually works and hardware eventually fails.
Yeah, absolutely. That's for sure. I think those were the challenges I really enjoyed, was we had to test in our team if something worked to a satisfaction, to our own very high standards. And then we had to show someone else externally, usually another vendor, that it actually worked. And here's the success criteria we're measuring against, And I think that comes back to, both of us are VCDX, both of us NPX. It's that methodology and how we think was enabling us to show, like for myself, it was showing VMware initially that a HCI platform running on NFS was highly available and resilient and performant, and that met their expectations for a supported platform in a production environment. And of course, VMware was skeptical because we were the first product doing it. Or Nutanix was the first product. I don't work at Nutanix anymore, in case anyone was wondering, but like we were the first to do it. So it's fair for people to be skeptical. And I think what we needed to do as architects was make sure that everyone knew what we had done to make sure and satisfy ourselves it was working, and then make that a repeatable test that someone else can validate independently. So I really enjoyed that.
Absolutely.
And you probably remember, our former boss, Lucas Lundell, great guy. Hi, Lucas, if you're listening. I hope everything's well with you. So we were told to check Exchange, see if Exchange would work. And, I remember in the early days, Exchange wasn't the best performing workload we had on Nutanix, but it worked reasonably well. It was viable. And over time, it got a lot better. But one of the challenges was making, the community and other vendors understand that, NFS actually was viable for block storage, even though it's a file storage protocol, that you can run a VMDK as block storage on top. And it gives you the same resiliency, the same features and everything that obviously the Microsoft product team were demanding, and quite rightly so, because they want their product, which is a critical product for so many customers around the world, they want to make sure that product works. So providing all that evidence, to Microsoft, showing that it was indeed following all the NFS protocols and it was compliant, with all the various block storage requirements, was something I really enjoyed, because I always second guess myself and I assume I'm wrong until I can prove that I'm either right or wrong. And if I'm wrong, that's okay. I'm happy to prove myself wrong. And if I'm right, well, that's fine as well. I don't really have a feeling either way, but that's something that creating a new market and a new product, I think one of the reasons Nutanix was so successful is because we were able to attract so many VCDXs in the early days. And I think we got up to 20-something VCDXs at some point at Nutanix. And I think there's still about 15 at Nutanix even to this day, which is fantastic. That, to me, obviously there was other people at Nutanix who were amazing as well, who were not VCDX, but what we provided as a group of architects back to the product team and back to the engineers and the executives and to the customers, I feel if we weren't there, HCI may not have become mainstream, because we wouldn't have proven all of these concepts all the way through to a physical implementation. And it might have just been HCI as VDI forever. And that would have been very disappointing, obviously, because the potential is what we're seeing in 2023. We're seeing, all the hyperscalers are supporting these solutions, and customers are, very interested in them. I would say they're not flocking there quite yet, but they're certainly quite interested. And I think we're at the bottom of the bell curve, and we'll see adoption, really ramp up in the next 12, 24 months.
Yeah, I think definitely now that it's more mainstream, it's definitely going to ramp. I think we're really at the the start of rapid adoption. So we're past the early adopters now, and we're getting into the more risk adverse adopters, and we've proven that over 10 years, right? And the architecture that we've put together, the documentation, the testing, the proof points, we had to be significantly more appealing than the status quo, because the easiest and least risky thing is to just do what you've always done that works. So we had to demonstrate and prove that we were substantially a better option, and a more economic option, simpler, more reliable, more robust for all of these very traditional, very risk adverse environments in the largest enterprises in the world and government organizations. And provide that documented evidence, those proof points to make sure it works, and then get the case studies to back it up in the real world as well, because doing something in a lab is one thing. Having it successfully implemented in a customer environment and run in production for a period of time is something completely different, and have all those learnings for when things go wrong.
So yeah, absolutely. I think I really enjoyed the case studies we used to do, and you deploy like 50,000 users of Exchange. I remember that was an AHV customer, actually, that one. In the earlier days, we had customers running Nutanix with ESX and Exchange on top of that as well. And they were fantastic projects. We had some of those were internal case studies, some of them were external as well. But yeah, that was really fantastic work. And like you say, the standard we had to prove that things were working to adopt these business critical apps. And like John Collar in the healthcare department, looking at all those type of apps like Epic and Meditech and all these other things, the bar is very high for those organizations. And I think that really comes back to, again, that methodology that we learn as architects is we can't just make it technically very attractive. We've got to make it commercially attractive. We've got to think about business continuity. We've got to think about things like operations. We've got to think support. So it's not just, is it fast? Have we got a million IOPS? It's the whole journey end to end, hence why I called my company end to end. But that's how we think as architects. We've got to think from all the way from the concept through to implementation and beyond. And I feel like that was one of the most rewarding things about being at a startup, creating a new industry, was being able to do that. And we had to think years ahead. Like supporting, SAP was years long project, as you well know. So yeah, that was a hell of a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's amazing how much of the world's financial systems run through a Nutanix platform these days.
Yeah, and I think that's a testament to the HCI concept overall. It's, you're scaling in these building blocks. You can scale up, you can scale out, you can do both. So making sure a platform can actually deliver that outcome and do it repeatably is really important.
At reduced risk, because that was the thing that really set us apart, is our ability to communicate how we can reduce risk compared to traditional environments. So, it's very easy to implement a vBlock or a FlexPod or a Flash Stack or whatever it happens to be, converged infrastructure. Put down $10 million and you get an amazing solution with amazing capabilities. But then how do you scale that down to a lower starting point, but giving the same capabilities to any sized organization, and then take that to a larger size. And then let's say you make a miscalculation, and instead of getting 18 months or 24 months worth of capacity out of it, your business grows significantly faster and you only get 6 months. Then you've got to put out another similar sized purchase order and get another one again. Whereas with HCI, you can start small, fractional consumption, grow as you need. If you make a miscalculation, it's not the end of the world. You add a couple of nodes and away you go. If you have a hardware failure, it's not an emergency anymore. It just self-heals, and it doesn't matter if it's the middle of the night. It just keeps on working, keeps on trucking, and the recovery times are just so much faster than traditional infrastructures, and the impact to performance during a recovery is also a lot lower. So all of these capabilities really just make it, that significantly better solution that made it easy to communicate that reduced risk to these very, very conservative organizations in all sorts of different parts of the world to get it across the line. And it was really cool being able to work on so many of those different projects.
Yeah, I remember one of the slide decks I created after a customer was asking me about resiliency in the early days was a 5-node cluster. And, you lose a node and it rebuilds, and it would show the data, repopulating across the cluster. And then I would talk about, hey, you only had RF2, which for those listening is 2 copies of your data. In the vSAN equivalent, it'd be failures to tolerate 1. And then what would happen is you could have a subsequent failure after that rebuild had occurred, and then the data would rebuild and you'd have a fully functional 3-node cluster, even on RF2 or FTT1, after 2 node failures, as long as they weren't happening at the exact same time and there was some opportunity for a rebuild. And I remember showing that at a V forum, I think it was in late 2013. I think it was November 2013. And people said, is that real? Normally you have a controller failure and it's like a massive problem, performance is through the floor, everyone's panicking, you're trying to get your replacement parts. and then the parts aren't available, so you're kind of at risk for days or a week or whatever. And I said, well, yeah, that's one of the advantages of this architecture, is that each individual node, is stateless effectively. I mean, there's stateful data on there, but it can be repaired quite quickly. And then as you scale, that rebuild can go faster. Obviously, there's more workers in the node, in the cluster, to perform those tasks. And I think that was one of the selling points that I found really easy about HCI was start small, scale in whatever fashion you need, and as you scale, your resiliency improves. And with a traditional SAN, of course, even if you're 0% used day one, your resiliency is what it is. Whether you're 0% or 99% full, your resiliency is what it is. Whereas with HCI, it actually could improve over time. So I think little things like that might not seem so significant to a business, but it really does translate to a great outcome and risk mitigation, because with a traditional SAN, it is an emergency if you have a controller failure. You have to address that quite quickly. You are at risk. A subsequent failure, you are offline. Even if the performance, some of the newer arrays, the performance degradation is minimal or none, but the risk is still there. So yes, the newer SANs might have, pure storage is pretty good when you have a controller failure. You might not even notice, but you'll definitely notice if the second controller goes offline, because you'll be out, you'll be offline. So I think that was a really cool thing that most executives understood, was the self-healing capability of HCI was far better and far more complementary to virtualization, which everyone, for so many years, believed in, and they knew how HA worked and the value of virtualization. And everyone sort of went, well, virtualization plus HCIs just makes sense. They're kind of a match made in heaven. And I think that's what we've seen now, some 10 years later, is it really is a match made in heaven to have virtualization with HCI, adding in the networking piece, adding in the storage piece, and scaling as we need to, so that we can have these hyperscaler solutions. We can have on-prem replicating wherever we like to completely different hardware from completely different vendors, because we have that consistent software layer. So some of this is obviously old news to most people, but I think it's nice to revisit and just see how much or how far things have come, and not take for granted the value of these offerings.
Yeah, and lifecycle management of the hardware and software as well. So making sure firmware, BIOS, BMC, drivers, everything's up to date and all the software is up to date, and taking away the complexity around managing the interoperability matrix because it's all automated. That's something that, if you haven't got the scars of managing a traditional 3-tier environment and, doing those checks manually and doing the HBA grabs and stuff, support grabs, you might not appreciate that. And probably people that have been running HCI for a while have sort of forgotten the old days where you had to go through and grab versions of everything manually and figure out which order you had to do operations in, otherwise things would break in weird and unusual ways, and that's just taken care of now. So it is really like an on-prem cloud experience when you're running HCI in the modern day.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, geez, I remember the early days of Nutanix. We had the NX 3450 was the original one, and I still had one working in my lab actually until the day I left Nutanix. It was still in there. It was still functioning 9 years later, funnily enough. So reliable Supermicro hardware, which I was skeptical actually of Supermicro when I joined Nutanix, but turned out to be fantastic. But
well, I think it was the Nutanix Supermicro hardware, more to the point, because it was a co-engineered and qualified design. So Supermicro are basically taking the design that we'd put together and manufacturing it, but we did the QA in design in conjunction with them. So we made sure it was, enterprise grade or telco grade robustness, and the shock and harshness and vibration and all the physical hardware chaos monkey type tests that we had to go through, pulling power supplies and network plugs and static discharge, and all those sorts of things that may not have necessarily have been done for all platforms that get manufactured, but that was part of the value that we brought to it. So, NX is different to Supermicro standard platforms. It's specially engineered. But that's also true of the other OEM platforms. They're co-engineered with Nutanix. All the components are, specified and certified and supported, so that we know how they operate and that they're going to be as robust and reliable as they possibly can be to support these enterprise workloads.
Actually, that reminds me of a common objection to HCI in the early days was you can't bring your own hardware. This is a horrible thing. I want to choose this hardware. This is the piece I want. Like, I want to use this, right? And we can't just run the software on anything. And I always used to say to people, like, does it really matter? Like, what we need is a reliable solution, right? There was a lot of people that were very focused on, I want to use a Dell piece of hardware or a HP or a Lenovo or whatever. But the thing with HCI was it was trying to create a business outcome, because guys like us were trying to build and architect solutions using the methodologies we follow that we've learned for many years to create a business outcome. So we weren't worried about, oh, what's the coolest hardware to use, or what's the fastest drive, or what's this or what's that. We wanted to have something reliable that you could drop in, it would work, and everything would function as you would expect, because we wanted to mitigate and minimize those risks for all the business critical apps we talked about earlier. And what I found really interesting was, in my career, I would say the hardest people to convince to spend money or to convince on a solution was the C-suite prior to being at Nutanix and looking at HCI. Because the tech guys, they're like, yeah, let's do it. It's great. Boom, I'm in. But at Nutanix, it became the C-suite who wanted the solution, because it was a packaged appliance and it just delivered an outcome, and it was simple, and they didn't have to retrain their staff. And that to me was a real paradigm shift, where I started thinking, wow, okay, I've really got to think like a CIO now, or a business owner, because I want an outcome. I don't want a specific hardware solution or whatever. I just want my outcome, and I want it as simply and reliably as possible, and cost effective and all these things. And the cost of...
So it delivers peace of mind.
Yeah. So the cost of like a Nutanix node or a vSAN ready node or whatever, they're usually slightly higher than if you were to bring your own and build it yourself. I would say in general, they're slightly more expensive. But I would say even if it was 50% more expensive, it's still cheaper from a total cost of ownership to buy the appliance, because you don't have to engineer it yourself. Your team doesn't have to go through all that testing and rigmarole and validation, all this stuff. And assuming you even did that, which most customers don't have the time, certainly sysadmins are not given the time and effort and space and test labs to do all that kind of work. But assuming they did, then they're still not doing it as often as someone like a Nutanix or a Dell or a Lenovo are testing these ready nodes or appliance nodes. So I think if you can give your sysadmin the time to focus on the applications and like multi-cloud solutions and other stuff, that appliance was so valuable. And the additional perceived cost, I think, was great value. I still think to this day the appliance was the best way by far to deploy HCI, and I still think that's true today. I think if you're a Nutanix,
it's definitely an advantage for time to market.
Go with an appliance. Don't build your own.
Yeah, that's why you do in the cloud. You get a T-shirt size, whatever instance, whatever it is, bare metal instance or a other type of instance, and it's an appliance effectively. That's what you're getting. You're signing up for a service level. You're getting an outcome, and it's been pre-tested and pre-certified, ready to go. And that's the same thing with HCI. You're buying that outcome. You're being able to innovate faster, deliver faster time to market, with more predictability, easier support, less downtime, so higher availability, and easier to recover and more graceful when things go wrong.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're engineering everything yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking back to an earlier episode. I think it was Matthias Eisner who mentioned, it's all about the outcome and simplicity, and you don't want to do things yourself. You want to let the cloud providers do it, or you want to let the vendor like a Nutanix or a VMware or whoever, you want to do that work for you on your behalf, and that's why you pay them for their solution. So I think it was Matthias, but Nonetheless, very consistent messaging actually from a lot of the guests on the podcast, because most of them either are VCDX or are well on the way to VCDX and have a similar experience coming from an architecture background. So understanding the value of something, is not in the nuts and the bolts, right? That's the commodity. Anyone can do that, but it's the sum of the parts that is the main.
And the integration into the ecosystem as well, and the automation, especially in the very, very large environments. But you don't want to be necessarily messing around with 50 million different variations of hardware, when the real challenge is making it work with your provisioning system and your automation system and your monitoring and capacity management systems and your request system and network management and all of that sort of stuff. Because in a lot of the larger organizations, they've made investments in Ansible and Terraform and ServiceNow, and they want everything that they put in to work in those same frameworks. And that's really where the integration is. And then piloting the solution to make sure that the service catalog that they're trying to deploy on it will fit, and that you're getting the right sized environment for the services that are going to run on it. It's more of a cloud approach than engineer everything yourself, because if you're going to engineer everything yourself, why wouldn't you just build it from scratch using open source tools? And the reason most organizations don't do that is because it costs 10 times more and it's 10 times less reliable than what you could get from a competent organization that's been doing that for 10 years now.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. Actually, that was one of the objections to Nutanix in the early days as well. And it's still an objection, I think, to vSAN and Nutanix as well, is why can't I just do it open source? Like, there's tools out there that can do the same. Well, I don't think that's true. I think the tools can potentially do some.
Come and see me next decade when it hasn't worked.
But yeah, the effort to do this yourself is extraordinary. And the benefit of having an organization like a Nutanix or VMware, whoever, is they're seeing it across thousands of customers. They're then working out which, hopefully, these companies are working out which features are the most useful and the most reliable, and engineering them, to meet those demands. So trying to do that yourself is very difficult. And in fact, I said on an earlier episode that if you come to end and ask us to design you an on-premises environment that has the same capabilities as Azure VMware solution or Nutanix NC2 or whatever it is, yeah, we can do that for you. That's fine. But the amount of time and effort it will take us to deliver that same result, right? We would prefer just to recommend you one of these hyperscaler solutions. It'll give you the outcome quickly. It's well tested, it's well engineered, and we can customize the piece on top. And I think that's the same story as HCI. The customer got an appliance, they got an outcome, and they could build the 20% on top instead of building the 100% from scratch, which is just way too much effort. I mean, geez, we had a team of so many
and slower time to market,
and it took years to get HCI to the point where it was accepted by the market. If you were trying to build that internally at even a very large customer, some of the Fortune 100 or even higher, even they don't have the resources to do that. That's why companies exist like Nutanix, and that's why products like vSAN and others have actually come into the market, because there's a huge demand for it.
Yeah, we've gotten to the point now with our validated designs and some of the automation that we've been working on for these really large global customers, such as big financial services environments, so they can build a complete cloud pod in 45 minutes. So once all the equipment is racked and stacked, and this is like a full availability zone, management zone as well, 45 minutes once they click the button on the automation to get the bare bones of the platform ready to go, and all the integration to their request management system so that users can start requesting services run on it. I mean, that you'd never think of being able to do that before.
Yeah, and that's like 10 years of innovation to get to that point for a pretty large, I mean, Nutanix is a pretty large company at this stage. So, to think that an IT organization, if there's any company out there who's got like 5, 6, 7,000 staff just in IT, I'm sure there's probably a few, but there's not many. And all of those people are not focusing on one task either, right? Or generalizing, but one task of building that kind of a solution. So hence far better business outcome to buy an appliance or buy something off the shelf and customize the parts that are missing than build yourself. I think, you'd just be paying architects like me way too much money to re-engineer the wheel, which is not required. So I would definitely not recommend anyone, engage architects, consultants, or whatever to build them a custom HCI solution. I think, there's two obviously major players out there that deliver great outcomes. So why would you consider option 3 or option 5 or option 10? Like, there's two amazing options. Go with one of them and you'll get a great outcome.
Or both of them if you're a big customer, because you want to be able to, keep them both honest at the same time.
Yeah, well, I mean, we had customers who deployed Nutanix and deployed vSAN, right? And they did it for that exact reason, because they wanted to make sure both vendors were honest, they were competitive commercially, and that they protected themselves innovation-wise. So if one company dropped the ball, they could move across and they'd already got all their operations sorted and monitoring and stuff like that. And it kind of challenged both companies to keep raising the bar and competitive. And obviously, it was a competitive market. And I just think there's so much potential for HCI that, it's barely scratched the surface. And I'm actually very excited for what we touched on earlier, which is 12 months from now, 18 months, 24 months, where people are seriously considering exiting their data centers or at minimum doing DR into one of these multi-cloud solutions. Because to me, building a DR site when you could go to one of these solutions today, it seems just huge cost, huge waste of time. When you've got these solutions you can run up in a matter of a day, you can have an environment up, running, connectivity, and the basics tested within a day, and then start actually piloting things. So actually one thing that I was speaking with one of the VMware people about was they're not seeing a lot of people do proof of concepts anymore because there's nothing to prove, right? What are we proving? Well, we know how VMware works. We know how vSAN works. What are we proving? What's the proof of concept for? It's actually just a waste of the customer's time and money to do a POC when we know what it does and doesn't do. What we really want to show is their apps actually working in the environment. That's the part that has an element of unknown to it and where they should focus. So now it's always a pilot rather than a POC. So it's pilot that gets migrated into production as opposed to a POC, a POC should never go into production. A POC should be decommissioned and then should be stood up separately. But that's what VMware was saying. And I think that's what we were seeing, when I was still at Nutanix as well with NC2, was customers knew the tech worked and they just wanted to pilot it and make sure that it did exactly what they expected with their apps. And then, go into production from there.
And there's a lot more of a DevOps culture now as well. So there's a lot of custom development, container systems and everything coming onto HCI. And then one of the challenges now is how do you size for something that's never been developed before because it's brand new? And then you've just got to have a scalable platform that can expand as it's needed, or you go with either NC2 type solution or a mix of cloud native with cloud services and an NC2 type solution. One of the real benefits we're seeing from cloud clusters, running Nutanix software on one of the hyperscalers, is you can get better density and better control over the workloads and better performance potentially at less cost because you're consolidating multiple instances down onto a bare metal instance that you've got tighter control over, rather than the massively overcommitted, normal instances of the virtual instances you get from those cloud providers.
Yeah, I'm definitely hoping to get another Kaplan on for an episode. So, Steve, if you're listening, you need to make some time for me, because I would love to go through with Steve what he and I did at Nutanix, which was talked about cloud waste and the fact that instances and T-shirt sizes had micro waste in them. And micro waste might sound like a buzzword, but that's just the amount of resource you're not using in an instance you've paid for. Multiply that by 100, 200, 500, 1,000, whatever it is, that adds up. So to your point, putting bare metal in there with the hypervisor, we're getting all that efficiency back and we're taking that control back. So, you might want to be in something like Azure because Microsoft's a great partner. You get licensing benefits from being in Azure, all these good things. So putting a hypervisor on top of some bare metal makes a lot of sense. You keep all of those benefits from Azure. You can still use some of that native services, but you're also consolidating down, just like we did with physical servers, onto virtualization many, many years ago. And to me, that's exactly what a native instance is in a cloud. It's a physical server. It's provisioned like a physical server. It's charged like a physical server. It's maintained like a physical server in most regards. I'm generalizing a little here, so don't hate on me, anyone who wants to contradict me on some of these points. But in general, it looks and manages like a physical server. The moment we put it on NC2 or VMC on AWS or AVS or whatever, we take that back and now it's managed as a virtual machine. And even things like containers, you can put containers onto Nutanix or onto vSAN, and you've got a standard platform for all your different workloads. You can benefit from the overcommitment. You can benefit from the storage efficiencies, and very scalable. It's accessible globally now. There's so many data centers that support these solutions. And for both Nutanix and for the VMware offerings, there's multiple hyperscalers supported. So if you have a preference for one over another, so be it. That's fine. But it's the same value. And what I would say to anyone listening, whether it's a CIO or whether it's the sysadmin or an architect or whoever, you should be considering using multiple hyperscalers because the solution overall is very similar. There's some complexities around connectivity, and there's still some things you need to do differently in each hyperscaler. But if 80% of it is the same, it gives you that risk mitigation and that portability. You might DR from hyperscaler 1 to hyperscaler 2, or you might run some workloads in one and some in the other. But I think there's a huge amount of value in that because now a lot of the cloud provider is abstracted. Just like virtualization abstracted the hardware, the same is true for the hyperscaler and hypervisor model. So, yeah, I love it. That's why my team are focusing so much on that at the moment, is because we see a huge amount of value for customers.
Or you can do bare metal as a service in a colo that's got the network port, the network pairing with all of the cloud providers as well. So, there's another option because a lot of the data centers where the hyperscalers are in are, colo facilities also. And you've got then multiple options to run the hypervisor on a bare metal as a service solution.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's kind of the middle ground between managing everything yourself and having a solution in the hyperscalers. That's kind of the middle ground, bare metal as a service. So, traditionally everything's on-prem. We have to do everything ourselves. Then we've got the hyperscaler, which is doing probably 80% of the work for us, which is cool. And then you got these ones in the middle, which it might be, say, 50-50. So customers have the choice, what level do they want to manage the infrastructure piece? And you've got a sliding scale. So I think it's great to have so many options. And I think we'll see less and less customers choose to manage things on-prem, whether that's in their data center or whether it's actually in a cupboard in the back of the office like we see with HCI a lot. Whether it's that or not, I think on-prem is going to become less and less popular over the next few years.
Well, it's just going to change because the on-prem, there's going to be a lot of cloud to edge. So the edge is still going to be, it's on-prem by default, right? So it's an edge. And there's a lot more processing going out to the edge, and there's a lot more requirements now going there with GPUs and AI. Because, like in retail space, the big retailers are looking for fraud detection and stock control and enhanced customer experiences with automated checkouts where you can literally just walk on out and the system's already taken care of all the products that you've got because it knows and it can track them around the store. So that's changing the landscape a bit because most data is going to be processed at the edge in the future, even if it's not persisted, because some of it's, or a lot of it is transient. Like you can imagine all of those camera feeds that are going through just to keep track of products for the checkout. They don't need to keep all of that video data. Once the transaction's done, they'll keep the transaction records, but they're not going to keep the video data. But maybe from a security perspective, the CCTV data might get persisted. So the requirements of the edge are changing. The requirements in the central data center may be moving because a lot of that may be going to the cloud in as well. Although we're starting to see some of the big retailers, if they're considering deploying significant GPU resources out at the edge when the stores are not run 24/7, considering to use those for training after hours as well. So, building a scheduler that can partition jobs and execute those jobs across the estate for the training aspect, and then putting those back into production for inferencing the next day. And just using the resources that they've got a lot more efficiently. So those are some of the new style things that we're seeing being thought about.
Yeah, actually, you raised a great point, and I meant to raise it earlier, which is testing environments. So back in the early days of HCI, that was one of the benefits. We had the intelligent cloning capabilities, and it was very quick and easy for us to clone databases and do all sorts of tests with them. And if we fast forward,
we did zero data copy clones before it was cool.
Yeah, that's right. I think we had a shirt about that as well. But now if we think about, if we bring it fast forward it to 2023, we've got the hyperscaler solutions. And now when we want to have a test environment, if we were to do that natively, we're cloning instances and we're paying for instances. We do that on a hyperscaler hypervisor solution, then we're not paying for those instances. So that's just another example of, if you are trying to modernize an app, then cool, you can do that. No one's against you modernizing the app, but making a copy of it, testing it, doing changes, you can do that on top of a hypervisor solution and not have to pay for it. And then when it's ready to go, then cool, move it across and pay for that instance if you so choose.
Yeah, and if you have to roll out 100 test environments and they're all the same, and you've got a zero copy clone, then there's no additional data movement either. So you've got no additional data costs. Whereas if you had separate EC2 and S3 instances, you have separate copies of everything that you're individually paying for all of it.
Yeah, and I think when there's cost
it's much
testing,
more efficient.
People avoid doing it, and we want the opposite. We want people doing as much testing as possible, having test environments, and testing upgrades and app modernization and all this sort of stuff. And if we make it cheap or free in the case of these zero copy clones, why wouldn't you test it? You can overcommit CPU. Obviously, if it's not in a production time, you can overcommit CPU a crazy amount, and everything runs okay. During production, you just don't run a bunch of tests on the test VMs, and you're actually okay. Or you can power them off, but you've still got access to that data that you want to test later. So I think there's so many benefits. To me, even if you want to use a lot of the cloud native services, and there's a lot of value in some of those services, the bulk of your infrastructure, to me, should be on one of these hypervisor solutions. And the niche should be on the native instance. Just even from a cost perspective, I think the hypervisor solutions on the hyperscalers have a bad rap at the moment. People think they're expensive. I'm actually in the opposite camp. I think they're great value for money, and I don't think they're expensive at all. The key is people are migrating like for like from on-prem into the hyperscaler solutions, and they're going, wow, this is crazy. This is twice what we pay on-prem, or something like this, three times, whatever the number is. But it's because they've oversized everything and they've taken inefficiency and put it somewhere where you've got the option to make things much more efficient. So I always say to customers, even prior to end-to-end, I always say, let's optimize what you've got today. Let's do an assessment, work out what you've got, optimize what you've got, and then make a decision on where the appropriate place for it to go is. There's no point looking at something that's inefficient and moving it and then working out what to do after the fact. You're creating extra work for yourself while at the same time paying one of the hyperscalers to run all those instances in inefficient t-shirt size, more than likely, and that's where all the cloud waste that Steve Kaplan talks about comes in, is the like-for-like migrations. Always, always, always do an assessment, right-size your workloads, get rid of stuff you don't need before you make a migration, because it makes your migration quicker and easier and lower risk and lower cost. So, you might say, okay, cool, we didn't get to the cloud as quick. I would argue that doing an assessment actually allows you to get there quicker because you've got less to migrate, more than likely. right? You've got less financial constraints getting you there. So I think, as with any design that you or I have done in the last probably 15, 20 years, we do an assessment first before we start making any decisions.
Start with the current state, gather all the business requirements and the constraints and the risks and the assumptions, and then build a solution that weighs all of those and gives the best trade-off and the best outcome for the best economic value.
And I think one thing that I think you and I have discussed a bit in the past is when we take our technical hat off and we put on our CIO hat, a lot of our technical decisions seem a little bit ridiculous. And, over time, we obviously focus on more enterprise architecture than solution architecture. But I think the key is for people like us, I know, obviously, we know each other very well. Michael and I have both tried to be like this as far as enterprise and solution architecture. We want to bring the two together and give someone that single resource that can lead enterprise and solution architecture, which is probably brings us to the next point I wanted to talk to you about is your VCDX and your NPX journeys, because you've got both. You're one of the few people in the world who have done both, and you are a continuous learner. One thing that friends of ours, like Richard James, always says to me, if you want to know something, don't bother Googling, just ask Michael. And it's true, because you are a continuous learner. You always challenge yourself to that next level, and I think VCDX was obviously a challenge. You were the 66th in the world, so very early number.
Yep.
And then NPX, you were part of the first batch that we did. So
I got the best number.
You got the best note, 007. It's very cool.
007.
Made this seventh episode, but unfortunately, you're way behind. This is about the 16th or 17th episode, I think. But
that's all right.
But anyway, talk to us about VCDX initially, and then talk to me about how we went about creating the NPX program and then the NPX journey. And, I can think of a lot of fun things we can talk to on this one. So I'll let you start though.
Yeah, VCDX and NPX are great learning experiences, and it's a great discipline to go through. And it really focuses you on enterprise class solution design that you can implement at any sized organization anywhere in the world and be successful. But the main thing is a full end-to-end solution, including project management plans and test plans, implementation guides, architecture design, and following a solution from infancy or inspiration through to completion and operations, and being able to prove that it works in the real world and defend it in front of a live panel of experts and peers that are probing and getting you to explain and justify your decisions, and being able to think on your feet and start design and troubleshooting processes live as you would in a customer situation if you had to lead a design process or a design workshop with a customer project team or a CIO, and the same with a troubleshooting process if you have to lead a large troubleshooting process. The process of going through it builds just so many skills and gives you exposure to so many different projects and opportunities. And I remember my VCDX, it was one of the early ones, even though the number was 66, it was only a couple of years into the program having been developed. And I used a particularly large financial services project as the basis for my VCDX. And it was, many hundreds of pages of documentation and testing and, a lot of security across networking, server, storage, applications. I knew everything in depth from end to end, all of the different capacity planning constraints, how the multi-data center infrastructure functioned to the application and the end users. And I was able to successfully defend that in front of a panel. I think I had Mustafa Khalil, Frank Denneman, and Daniel Rathmeyer as my panel, and they're very famous VCDXs in the VMware world. And it was a very nerve-wracking experience. And it was funny because I remember sitting at VMware campus in the morning before my panel was about to start, and Mark Brunstad was the program manager at the time, so he was in the room there as well as the moderator. And I found a whole lot of mistakes in my design on the morning that I was about to walk into the panel. and fortunately, they didn't ask me directly about those mistakes, but because the panel went pretty well, I was able to bring those mistakes to their attention and acknowledge them and say what I would have done differently and how I would have fixed those particular errors as well. And then because it's not just the design that you've done that you've got to defend, but you've got to start a design process as well, given requirements from the panel. And you've got to start and lead a troubleshooting process given a scenario from the panel as well. And that is just very difficult because it could absolutely be anything, and it could be any technology, and you've got to follow a logical process to prove that you can fit into any environment anywhere in the world, any size. And that's really challenging and exciting, and it is a very worthwhile process to go through because it's really allowed me the opportunity to work with so many different organizations and customers all across the world of different sizes, governments, private enterprises, not-for-profits, and do some pretty cool things. NPX we took to another level. VCDX is tough. It's very, very tough. There's only a few hundred in the world that have been able to get through the program. I know you've got double VCDX, so you're a glutton for punishment. You've done it more than once. NPX was we took the learning and the experience from VCDX and we made it more multi-cloud, multi-hypervisor, sort of a hybrid cloud process. And the level of documentation is similar in terms of implementation plan, project plan, test plan, architecture design, but also taking into account emerging technologies and other areas that we felt were important that the VCDX didn't cover, and putting more of a focus on the applications and solutions in the ecosystem that's on top as well, where that wasn't technically necessarily a requirement for at least the data center virtualization component of the VCDX. So being able to have to defend a multi-hypervisor, potentially hybrid cloud solution is a bit more challenging, especially when you're defending your design, which and you've written, it end to end. You should know your design because you're the one that wrote it. Even if you do it as a team, which we definitely recommend doing as a team because it just cuts down the effort in terms of documentation, but everybody has to individually defend every decision. Then switching to a completely different hypervisor for the design scenario and troubleshooting scenario, you've really got to have that multi-site hybrid cloud, multi-hypervisor knowledge to the same depth. So if you chose to defend a VMware design and then you decided to switch to Hyper-V or AHV as the scenarios, then you'd have to know those hypervisors and the impacts and the trade-offs and the justifications equally as well as you did for vSphere. So that's what makes NPX significantly harder. And more of the emerging technologies and application focus as well. And I think we're up to about 24 NPXs now. I may not have the latest number. But that's, So it was a great experience. It's given me access to a lot more customers, a lot different size customers. I'm working with some customers now that have got 200,000 databases in their environment, millions of virtual machines. And I don't think I'd have the same opportunities if I hadn't gone through the program and, had a requirements-driven, customer solution focused certification that really proves you're at the top of your game. So you already have to be at the top of the game to even, apply for VCDX or NPX. And this really just proves you're at where you think you're at, and that you can be very flexible and adaptable and continually learning as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the NPX for sure. I remember we're sitting in at Nutanix headquarters in one of those rooms, and there's about 20 of us, and we were talking about the value of being able to defend on two hypervisors, and whether it's AHV and vSphere, or whether it's vSphere on-prem and it's vSphere on AVS, right? It's still two environments. There's still two different things to consider. And I think that's part of the evolution of HCI, which is why we included it in NPX. It was because it was critical to know more than one thing. it wasn't just a hypervisor, it was also either a cloud provider. And certainly at that time, Nutanix was trying to make solutions where you could fail over into AWS native instances and stand them up and things like this. So I remember that going into the thought process for the certification as well is, okay, cool, we've got these appliances and we're doing all this cool stuff, but what else are we doing on top of that with the hybrid cloud stuff? So it was almost like the hypervisor, hyperscaler solutions were being thought of at that time. And I think that's where the innovation started, actually, from that program.
We wanted to make it future-proofed and also to get, some good ideas back from the candidates that could then be implemented into products as well. So things that are missing, gaps, and how, would they solve those gaps to make it future-proofed as technology changes.
Yeah, I remember one thing that I did, because obviously, for those listening, you would have heard Michael talk about the fact that you had to defend on one hypervisor and then do design on another. And I remember thinking, wow, okay, this customer, the design I used, they were actually looking to migrate from vSphere to AHV for this one workload. And I thought, oh, okay, cool. Well, I'm going to do that design anyway. So I'm going to convert the design from, in this case, it was from vSphere to AHV, and then change all the design decisions. So for those who have known me a long time, I used to document design decisions on my blog. So I literally got all the design decisions I made for the original solution, and I went through them, and I crossed out all the things that, AHV didn't support. AHV was a very basic hypervisor at the time. So I went through and, changed everything I could, and remade all those decisions and rethought through that whole process. And I tell you what, that saved me in my NPX defense. It was just going to that detail and writing all those architectural decisions out and rethinking what I'm going to do with the different constraints. At the time, AHV didn't have a lot of the features of ESX, so we were constrained in how we would do things. Even the way HA worked was different. There was no equivalent DRS functionality at the time. It was a significant jump from vSphere to AHV, and that's how we went about it. I think all of us converted our designs to AHV.
That's what I did.
And then I defended AHV, which was what the customer ultimately implemented. And then in the design scenario and the troubleshooting, it was based on ESX, which, of course, I was far more comfortable with. Because as you very fondly remember, I think, we were at Nutanix HQ. I can tell you know where I'm going with this already. So we're at Nutanix HQ, and we had the Linux Foundation come in and talk to us about KVM. And we sat this 3-day course, 5-day course. It was a multi-day course.
Yeah, I think it was 4 or 5 days.
Boy,
that was tough.
I tell you what, I knew exactly that I knew very little about KVM at the start of that course. And at the end of that course, funnily enough, I knew a lot of things I didn't know. And I knew a lot of things, like there were known unknowns, I think it's called, right? So I knew I didn't know these things. Whereas at the start of the course, I had no idea what I didn't know. I just knew I knew nothing, right? So, but then what I really, really realized was KVM, at least at that time, I wouldn't want to touch that thing with a 10-foot pole, because that was so complicated, and just the risk and complexity was enormous. And the thought of Nutanix implementing KVM natively as it was, I was like, this is going to ruin our company. Like, this is going to be terrible. We need to vastly improve how KVM works and hide all that complexity under the covers. Otherwise, we're going to go bust. Customers are going to laugh at us.
Well, we didn't just hide the complexity. We just removed the complexity. It was so many unnecessary things that really didn't need to be there. And that's really where AHV itself came along. I mean, back in that day, there was no user interface to it. It was all command line, but the command line was just so simple and easy to use. We had customers jumping at the opportunity to use it that were, already heavily invested in Linux. They wanted something simple and easy to use, that they could use the DevOps approach. And it just fitted the bill, even though it was quite feature limited at that time. And it's fully featured in enterprise class now with, APIs, user interface, command line, and everything. And it's incredibly simple and easy to use now. But back in that time, it was brand new. It was quite a different story. But just the the concept around AHV itself and making KVM simple and easy and, fully enterprise class was brilliant, and really worked incredibly well. And we had some really massive customer wins really early on, and they're still customers to this day. 7-8 years later, still running their core business critical, massive global infrastructures on AHV on the latest versions that have been, drastically enhanced to their fully featured state now. And that was pretty interesting. And then trying to fit that very early version into an enterprise class design of a real world customer that's already been implemented and successful on vSphere. Now that was an interesting process. And then I did mine as part of a team. So we had my original VCDX design that was a financial services, implementation. And we took that, it was about 400 and something pages to start with in its VMware version. Because AHV was so much simpler, I think we cut it down to about 120 pages, maybe 100 pages, because there was just so much less needed to get it to a fully working and functional state. But the good thing about doing it as a team is it just made doing all the documentation that much easier, because it's still a significant lift to do the documentation to an enterprise class standard. And that was a really great process to go through. Every single person on the team successfully defended the design and were able to achieve their NPX.
Yeah, I mean, I remember it well. Obviously, we were part of the pilot program. And for all the candidates in Michael's team, I was the panelist for, or I was one of the panelists for. And I remember because from when Michael defended, obviously I learned a lot from Michael over the years, but when you defended, you did such a great job. Obviously you passed, and we can't talk about it too specifically, but you did such a great job. But then I saw Lane defend it, Lane Leverett. So he's NPX number 2, I think. And then I learned something new from Lane, because he approached it from a slightly different angle and presented in a bit of a different way. And then I think Samir Roshan, who's NPX 6, 7, I'm not sure. Sorry, Samir. But, he's one of the early guys as well. He defended, actually, I think he's number 5, now that I think about it. There you go. So,
yeah, and there's Kohler as well.
And then John Kohler as well was on the team. So as a panelist, I tell you what, being a panelist is a great learning experience. And I've observed VCDX panels before, and I was a formal panelist for NPX, of course, and that's such an amazing learning experience, because you have to try and, as you well know from doing it yourself on both sides, both companies, you have to learn the person's design. You have to look at all their decisions. You have to consider their design. So we almost go through more effort than the candidate in a way, because we have to know everyone's design. We have to know all the good, all the bad, all the areas we need to ask questions in able to, get to that minimally qualified candidate level. And that was a fantastic experience, because I learned so much about AHV. I learned so much about vSphere, obviously the apps you were talking to. So what I would say is one of the values of VCDX and NPX is actually getting the certification ultimately. But when you get it, that's the start to me. That's just very early on in the VCDX journey, which both of us have been VCDX for 10 plus years. I feel like that was just the start of where I started to become a good architect. And from there, we continually grow. And being a panelist, I almost did that selfishly. I wanted to learn more. I just want to be a sponge and learn off the candidates and learn off, the panelists as well. And it's so good. There's so many good things you learn from being a panelist that I would actually recommend everyone who's got an NPX or a VCDX or anything like that is be a panelist. It's a fantastic learning experience. And more importantly,
it is massive learning experience.
More importantly, though, if we can grow these programs, NPX has got, less than 30. VCDX is still just hit 300. I would love to see both programs have hundreds and hundreds more, because then customers will see the value of these programs, because most customers would then be able to access a VCDX or an NPX to therefore have that experience. Whereas at the moment, I feel like most customers have no idea what a VCDX is, because it's just not enough. If there was only 10 Teslas in the world, only 10 people would know how good a Tesla is. Obviously, we're big Tesla fans, but I feel like part of the goal of my company end to end is actually make VCDXs and NPXs accessible to customers, right? They don't have to have them as their day-to-day partner doing all the work, but they can engage them for certain projects or design reviews or whatever it is a lot easier, because most companies simply can't afford to grow a VCDX from scratch, or they can't afford to hire a dedicated person at that level. So hence end-to-end is here to provide that on projects, where a partner may have a skill set gap. And I think part of my goal personally is to get VCDX NV. I want to do that in the next 12 months if I can. So putting the pressure on myself. It's August 16th, 2023. So hopefully I've got that by this time next year. But yeah, giving customers that access, but also us growing more VCDXs and NPXs internally. So a bit of a pitch on what my company's doing for those listening is we've got 3 tiers of architects: a senior solution architect, which is like a double VCAP or a VMware Certified Advanced Professional. Someone who's got 2 of those would be usually a principal architect at another company. That's kind of our baseline. And then above that, you've got a principal who's always going to be a VCDX or an NPX, or ideally both. And then a chief architect would be someone, like Rene Vanderbedem, who's just, the best of the best. He's got 4 VCDXs, he's got an NPX, he's got a few other things. I think he's got his TOGAF and things like that. So the chief one is really for those standout architects. Michael, you'd obviously fall into that category, just to rub that ego a little bit. But, that's definitely for people like you and Rene. But the idea is those architects are accessible to customers, and our principals will have a senior architect assigned to them to mentor. So this is not a maybe we'll mentor our staff or this would be nice to do. This is absolutely what we're doing at End to End, is trying to grow expert architects. And these programs, for my team are mandatory. You will absolutely, if you want to go to principal and get the associated remuneration and bonuses and whatever, you will go through that program, and the whole team are here to help guide and grow those people. And even if, Nutanix or VMware or both disappeared tomorrow, and I had a team of 20 VCDXs and 20 NPXs, the value of that skill set and the methodology is enormous, which can be translated into any technology. So that's part of the goal of the company, is to make smart people like yourself.
Yeah, well, getting requirements-driven solution enterprise design is the key, and being adaptable to any type of environment. And you're quite right. It doesn't matter if it's VMware, if it's Nutanix, if it's anything, because you've got to be able to operate in that full end-to-end, no pun intended, enterprise environment with an enterprise ecosystem with all the components that entails, and come out with a customer outcome and meet their goals and test it and prove it. And that is not one specific technology. That's many, many technologies and many project and business processes and discipline and documentation that's required to be able to achieve that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've told you this story, but for our listeners, when I left Nutanix, one of the first projects I was involved with, the customer was a VMware customer, and they had Pure Storage. And initially I thought, oh, geez, Pure Storage, I haven't done a lot with Pure Storage. I've probably talked bad about them a couple of times, but I've probably talked down about SANs and all this stuff. But what I found very quickly, probably half an hour after jumping on that project, was all I was doing was applying the methodologies from these certifications to this new environment. And it was very easy. Picking up Pure Storage or a new technology is actually quite easy once you understand conceptual, logical, and physical. Once you understand the basics of virtualization and storage, a new product that comes on the market is actually the easy part. If you have learnt that methodology, it's very quick to upskill. And yeah, certainly I've found that. And if you go sit an exam on a topic that is built on virtualization and the concepts of virtualization, and you've never looked at that product, you can probably guess your way through that exam and have a high chance of passing because you understand the methodology. So I found that really interesting, that actually very quickly I felt like I was really good with Pure Storage because I just applied that methodology. I went through the requirements. I went through what I was trying to achieve. I tested those requirements and constraints against this product that I hadn't spent a lot of time with. I'd done some testing of Pure Storage in the past, but not years worth of effort. And everything went really well. Like it was really just really good enterprise and solution architecture work. And it happened to be a Pure Storage box sitting in there, and it happened to be, a Commvault backup technology instead of, say, Nutanix snapshots and replication and whatever. But these methodologies are so flexible that, I feel like you could throw me into any technology and throw any VCDX, in fact, into any project, and they would be fantastic leaders of those projects. And there's always going to be SMEs in certain technologies that you'll gain advice from. But overall, I feel like a VCDX and NPX can lead pretty much any project, even non-technology based projects. I apply VCDX methodologies in my day-to-day life, which is a little bit sad maybe, but they help.
Yeah, I mean, think you still need to know traditional, 3-tier components anyway, because oftentimes you'll be migrating off them. You need to give customers advice on, best practices and, architecture, reuse opportunities, coexistence and those sorts of things as you're migrating to the new solution. Or you need to troubleshoot and fix it to stabilize it before you can migrate to a new solution. So, there's always going to be legacy.
That comment you just made about, fixing something before migrating reminded me of our boot camps that we've run many times for up and coming architects.
Absolutely.
Where we created a scenario where, we gave the candidates, an environment, traditional 3-tier that was struggling with performance and resiliency and had all these issues. And we asked them to create a migration plan. And then along the way, we would say, oh, you can't do that because it hit its CPU limits, or it hit its performance limits, or it hit its capacity limits. And we would ask candidates to consider what other options they had to complete this migration. And we would just keep throwing spanners in the works, as we call it in Australia. I don't know if that translates to New Zealand or anywhere else in the world, but we would basically just throw problems at the candidates to see how creative they would become and look at their conceptual thinking and translating conceptual, logical, and physical. And in the end, it was things like optimize. Let's optimize before we move, which had to be the solution. Because if you optimize and you still can't
stabilize,
you're stuck. So I remember those boot camps well, and I would love to run some more in the future. Even completely technology agnostic, I think there's a huge gap in the market for genuine enablement of architects and technical leaders managing critical situations, which is another offering at end-to-end, funnily enough, is critical situation management, where you would get an expert architect in to lead that remediation, to try and discover where the problems are, to work out what the interim solution is and the medium term and then the long-term solution. There's a huge gap in that market. I remember managing these at Nutanix sometimes and at IBM prior to that. And the moment you get in a room and you follow a proven methodology, it's amazing to see how quickly these critical situations can get resolved. And they go from, all hands on deck in a war room to, okay, cool, this is manageable now. We can just work on this during business hours. And then a couple of days later, the situation is stood down. I think we should definitely collaborate on some of those and, put something out there for people to come to, because I certainly wish that was available 15, 20 years ago when I started doing a lot of architecture, whereas you and I learnt it the hard way.
With the scars to show
lots of scars from those things. But, those boot camps are fantastic. And that's probably another topic we should talk on is the business critical apps boot camps. We both authored some of those for Nutanix and ran a few of them. What would you say if you were to break those boot camps down into 5 minutes? What are some of the things you would want potential candidates to think about, or anyone trying to become an architect or to focus on business critical apps? What are some of those key takeaways from those boot camps?
I would say the first thing is risk reduction, because the first thing you got to take care of is risk. We provided a solution for free. If you introduce risk and that causes downtime or availability concerns for the customer, it could cost the customer more than the entire solution would have been worth in the first place. Especially when you're talking about very large global 2,000 accounts where it could be millions or tens of millions of dollars downtime per hour. Risk reduction is number one. Knowing the end-to-end solution and the application requirements and technologies to support it in the best possible way, and then being able to match those to the customer's requirements, both functional and non-functional, and all the service levels, so manageability, availability, security, recoverability, performance, and the interrelationships between them all as well. So security problems can cause performance problems if you get denial of service attacks. Performance problems can cause availability problems because the performance could be so bad that the users consider the application is completely down. And does that trigger a recovery to a DR site, or do you have some sort of a failover process, be it manual or automated? All of those things are interrelated, and being able to understand that and how it maps to the solution. So taking the requirements, the constraints, and the risks and the assumptions for the applications and the business, and then mapping that to a solution that reduces risk and does things as efficiently and cost effectively as possible. So you're really looking for the least worst solution, because it's always going to be a compromise, because that's what real world requirements driven solutions are. They're trade-offs. There's always trade-offs and constraints.
And I think you hit the nail on the head. Risks being the first one, is we have to minimize the risk of any sort of issue for the customer as architects. And I think that falls more into the enterprise architecture space than the solution architecture space. But obviously it's in both camps. But that's what we really talk about when we say enterprise architecture. It's thinking from a business perspective. Solution architecture is more from the technical, and the two should overlap significantly as well. It shouldn't be the solution architect gives something to the enterprise guy, or the enterprise gives it to the solution architect. They should be a team. They should be very well overlapped. I would say at least 50% overlapped in general, if those two people are going to work together, or teams of people ideally are going to work together. But risk mitigation is something that, I've certainly not seen a lot of in my career. And even at various vendors, you identify a product has a gap, and to try and mitigate those risks can be an uphill battle. But it's what we do as architects. So for sure, any up and coming architect, or anyone who's currently doing architecture, look through your designs. If there's not a lot about risks in there, that's a really good area where you could improve. And risk, like if you look at the risk likelihood and the risk impact, and the likelihood is, say, a medium, and the impact is high or medium, that's a really good justification to go and ask for funding for a project to mitigate that risk. And if you can communicate that risk in a non-technical manner back to a CIO or a high-level manager or something like that, you'll get funding. So for any sysadmin out there, if you say, because it's cool or it's fast or it's something, you'll never get funding for anything. But if you actually map it back to the business requirements, it's amazing. The checkbook comes out when you can mitigate genuine business risks and measurable outcomes as well. So I think that's a great tip.
Yeah, and then there's a little bit of project management, service management, change management, all wrapped in there as well, which helps with the risk reduction, because, doing proper change management, service management is going to help reduce risks.
Absolutely. Well, I've taken up a lot of your time today, Mike. I just realized it's quite late for you. It's coming up to 9 p.m. for me.
It's quite late. I'm still a bit jet lagged as well from all the travel I've been doing
so it's
recently.
almost 11 p.m. for Michael, for those listening. So he's so smart, even at 11 p.m. at night. So we're definitely lucky to have you on, Michael. So any closing thoughts? I can't even speak now. It's so late for me. I go to bed early for those listening. But any closing thoughts for our listeners? And no doubt we'll have you back on in the future. But what would you like to say to our listeners?
Yeah, I definitely encourage any aspiring architects to really look at the VCDX and the NPX programs and the blueprints and the preparation guides that go with those programs. Even if you choose not to go down that path, the outline and the preparation guide and the requirements give you a really good idea about what an enterprise class design at the Global 2000 level entails and what should be expected. And that's, you can create a learning and training path and a career development path off of that. And making sure solutions map to requirements and manage risks, do the best you can with the trade-offs and the constraints that you're working within. And now that HCI is mainstream and it can run anywhere, it should be a primary consideration for any type of project. And if you find something that's never been done before on HCI, I'd love to hear about it.
Oh, absolutely. Anyone who can find something HCI hasn't done yet, please tag Michael and I on Twitter, or it's not even Twitter anymore, it's X. So I get all these notifications from X now, which it's a bit dodgy. But
at least it's only one.
Yeah, that's right. So anyway, tag us on X, and we'd love to hear it because, I think Michael and I, and certainly some of our colleagues or former colleagues of mine at Nutanix have seen pretty much everything from HCI, and we'd love to do an episode on any niche use case or any niche issue or constraint that someone might have come up with. So, whether it's a Nutanix or a vSAN or another product, there's not really other products out there that really meet the bar, to be honest, in my opinion. But nonetheless, I'd love to hear about it, and maybe we can do a multi NPX VCDX podcast and talk about some of these solutions in a reasonably agnostic manner. But anyway, Michael, thanks again. It's absolutely a privilege to have you on. Talk to you as always.
Thank you very much.
And look forward to seeing you in the near future.
Yeah, it was great to be here. Thanks very much, Josh. Bye.